Good, thank you. Well, let me welcome you all here to another instalment of our Pupil Policy in Place seminar series. Welcome to everyone in the room, but also to the 15 or 20 people who are online. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kim Humphrey. I'm the director of the Melbourne Institute here at CEU. And before we go any further, let me acknowledge that in terms of this room at least, we're meeting here today on the beautiful lands of the Larrakia Nation. And let me pay my respects to the Larrakia people, but also to Larrakia elders, past, present and rising, and acknowledge their continuing custodianship of their lands and waters, knowledges and communities. I extend that welcome to all First Nations people here. Well, I'm very, very pleased to welcome back Professor Dany Adone to the Northern Institute. Dany is no stranger to the NI. She is in fact an adjunct professor here at CEU and has been for quite some time. When she isn't back here, Dany is also chair of Applied English Linguistics at the University of Cologne in Germany, and is co-founder of and director, or a director of the Centre for Australian Studies at Cologne. There are a number of Australian Studies centres around the world. Cologne is one of them. Dany also has ties across the country to various other institutions. So she's a visiting professor at IATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra, a visiting scholar at Miriwoong Sign Language and Culture Centre at Kununurra. I hope I pronounced that reasonably okay. And an associate professor at the University of Sydney. Dany's research focuses principally on language endangerments and language contact in Indigenous Australia, and she's conducted fieldwork in those areas since 1992, so for many, many decades, working principally with Indigenous communities in Ireland. Today, Dany is going to speak to us on some of that research. Her paper today is titled Zooming on to Bimodal Bilingualism in Remote Indigenous Communities, and it fascinatingly explores the simultaneous use of both a sign language and a spoken language into Indigenous language contexts in Northern Australia, one in Ireland and one in Northern Western Australia. The abstract alone, and I read it 2 or 3 times, that is fascinating enough. So I'm sure this talk is going to actually be a whirligig of linguistics research as we proceed. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Dany, and welcome Professor Dany Adone.
Thank you very much.
So,
before I start, I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, on which I'm today, and also where I conducted research. I still conduct research, which is Miriwoong in Dany, as well as living land at Kununurra. I pay my respect to the elders of communities, past, present, and emerging. I extend this respect to all First people. Just a short notice here, Indigenous viewers are respectfully advised that this document contains the names and images of persons who have passed away, which may cause distress. But I had permission to, before we started the project a while ago. I'll explain later if anyone wants some clarification. So just a few pictures here of the other researchers involved in the sign language projects, my auntie and the Kununurra people, some of the Kununurra team, and down there on Bimodal Islands, and also elsewhere on outstations around on Elko and Kununurra. Sorry, my thing is very sensitive, so it just Yeah. Okay, so I'll just give you an outline of the paper. In part one, I would like to start with an overview on bilingualism, multilingualism, provide some definitions, and also show how the contribution, how bilingualism, multilingualism has contributed heavily to the progress of linguistics in several fields. Part two takes a sort of close look at sign language research, because I'm not sure how many of you are sort of familiar with the whole sign language research, and especially looking at the distinction in the field between what we call primary and alternate sign language. Part three will then describe bimodal bilingualism in remote indigenous communities, and will zoom onto the linguistic behaviour of the bimodal bilinguals. At time, I will draw, I will compare what we know from the field on bimodal bilingualism, especially the work that has been done so far on bimodal bilingualism from a, let's say, global north perspective. I'll come back to that. So two goals here, to explore the type of bimodal bilingualism in remote communities, which offers us very interesting insights into how things can be elsewhere, and it also offer new insights into the bimodal bilingual relation and linguistic strategies we use within the two modalities. Okay, very quickly, just to give a brief sort of overview. The field of bilingualism has been around for quite a while, and actually it's one of the core areas, I would say, of linguistics. It's quite recent, I think 1987 around, plus minus, that some of the linguists, at least David Crystal, admitted that bilingualism is widespread in the world and is actually the norm rather than having monolingualism as the norm. And we also know that bilinguals grew up with two or more languages. So I will use the term bilingualism to also, which extends to embrace multilingualism. Okay, so there are several types of bilinguals in the field that have been documented, so-called balanced bilingual, unbalanced bilingual, dominant, weak. All sort of people have come up with a lot of definitions, because from the studies that have been conducted so far, not every bilingual acts the same way. And there are some of them a bit more, let's say, they are dominant in one language. Others, I would say, more or less weak in one language. It all depends on a lot of factors, such as exposure, when they started learning, etc., etc. But anyway, the studies have revealed that bilinguals know when to use which language, and similar to monolinguals, bilingual interaction is rule-governed. I say this because for a long time, at least in Europe, it was there was a common idea in the 60s, 50s, 60s, people thought, all right, okay, you're going to confuse a child if you let the child grow up with two languages. Oh God, please don't do that. At least from the pedagogical point of view, a lot of teachers used to discourage the parents of, well, mixed marriage, and telling them not to do that. But nowadays, as you probably know, a lot of European countries have changed their minds, the policies, and actually bilingualism, multilingualism is being promoted across Europe, and so that's one thing. The other thing is, having said that, a bilingualism or bilingual children, adults, their speech, their interaction was regarded as something, let's say, random. Okay, so you've forgotten a word, or you just switch to another language, but it's not that. Just that. I mean, you forgetting a word, replacing it with another language is one thing, but that's not what happens in bilingual interaction. It's, as we said, rule-governed. There are very specific sides. If you listen to what I would call proficient bilinguals, you will see that they don't switch between languages randomly. And it looks random, but when you start analyzing these, you realize, oh, there are some boundaries that they observe unconsciously, because it's all there. And also another point is, proficient bilinguals never, let's say, there is no miscommunication or failure in communication while they are switching between the languages concerned. Right, the contribution of studies on bilingualism in linguistics. As I said, the studies on bilingual speakers from different parts of the world have informed several branches of linguistics. So, for instance, how spoken sign languages are acquired when the people involved the kids are bilingual, so L1, L2. So that's in the domain of psycholinguistics. Also, in the domain of sociolinguistics, we find that languages, how they are used in society, how they reflect identity, and all these questions is part of the agenda in sociolinguistics. How languages are processed and stored in the brain, a lot of new insights on how people navigate with these two languages and where these languages are stored, how they are stored in the brain is also very interesting, and that's what we find in neurolinguistics. And finally, how languages are affected by dementia, aphasia, neurodevelopmental disorders, such as SLI, specific language impairment. That's the domain of clinical linguistics. And here again, the study of bilingualism has contributed a lot. So very quickly, I don't want anybody to get impatient there. What is bimodal bilingualism? Some definition. So the broadest definition of a bimodal bilingual is someone who uses language in two modalities, including sign, spoken, written, and tactile. So that's one of the broadest definitions, but we take here a narrower definition because we have very specific cases. So by here in this study, but also the study that we'll be referring to from Lilo Martin and others, we are looking at the use of languages in two modalities. So for instance, the spoken language, which goes through the auditory vocal channel, and the sign language, which goes through the visual gestural channel. In this context, it is also important to note that both languages we are referring to here are natural languages. So there is no invented systems as we can see in sign English, for instance. And also similar to other bilinguals, and we call them unimodal bilinguals, the bimodal ones are very often exposed to both languages from birth. And in contrast to hearing people, for instance, learning a sign language as a second language, L2. Another point worth mentioning is that like other bilinguals, and that's very interesting, very exciting for us linguists, when we look at bimodal bilinguals, we find that they also show typical bilingual effects. So one of them is both languages are always on, so to say, because you can, through several experiments in the neurolinguistic field, we've seen that it's a question of milliseconds. You say something, you switch, and you go on. And also, to be able to do that, it means that the two languages have to be standby all the time, and very often also competing with each other. So that's why sometimes a word would just slip in another language. It happens to me quite often too. So that's one thing. And also what's for us very specific here is that with the bimodal bilinguals we look at, they show a unique bilingual phenomenon which we call blending, which has been documented already in the field, but in a different context. I'll come to that. Very quickly, a look at sign language research. I'll focus on the primary and versus alternate sign language because it has some bearings on what we are doing at the moment. So the primary sign language is one acquired by either and one by the deaf population. That's the sort of general understanding we have in the field. And with that, it means that there is a conventional language model that is being transmitted from generation to generation with rules, etc., etc. So prescriptive rules and structures, and also a high degree of what we call conventionalization. And here I touch upon the issue, the opposition between written tradition and as compared to oral tradition, which is considered to be a very debatable matter in bilingualism. Now, alternate sign language, this is a term that has been given to the sign languages, the Indigenous Sign Language of Australia by Kendall in 1988. He was the first one to do an extensive study. And it's a language, sign language that is used, that has been developed by people already competent in spoken languages. Now, based on our own observation, working with La Wopa and the Yolŋu team in Arnhem, as well as with the people in Kununurra, we sort of distance ourselves a bit from the term alternate because we realize it's not really alternate anymore. So but there is also this distinction here that there are different types of alternate sign languages. I would keep using the term alternate for now because I don't have a better, we haven't found a better term. We have found, for instance, that there are elaborate, complex alternate sign languages. Yolŋu Sign Language is one of them, and there are restricted alternate sign languages with, like, let's say 1,500 signs plus minus, and even other languages that are more restricted depending on the context. There is only a small amount of context that come into that are used where people use the sign language. So these would be about 500 signs, about plus minus. So this is to show you that there are different degrees of alternate sign languages, different types. Very early studies on indigenous sign languages in Australia report the use of signing system in many places in indigenous Australia. Warner, for instance, the well-known anthropologist, on Miriwoong Sign Language, which is Yolŋu Sign Language today. Polish in 1886 on Narakia Sign Language, and Priest on Tiwi Sign Language, etc., etc. So it's been documented. People have documented, but very often it's not been a systematic documentation. People have noticed something happening, gestures, so they've collected the gestures, they've collected whatever it was there that was not spoken language, and said, oh, all right, we've seen something happening there in these communities. And as I said, in some places the sign language is highly developed, and in others they are less. So here is a map, or actually two maps. The one from ITIS that you know behind to see the spoken languages, and the one that I've put on, which comes from Kendon's work, where, I mean, it shows the sign languages he's been able to collect data, but also documentation from the early reports from anthropologists and others. And as you can see, in Western Desert area, there is a bit of we see that there aren't too many sign languages. We can't deduce from that there aren't sign languages, because the point was there was not much documentation. But for instance, if we go a little bit higher, around Kununurra, as you will see on the map, it has been reported that at that time sign languages were used only for very restricted contexts, such as, for instance, widows, when there is a speech taboo going on. So that's when people use sign language. So it is obvious then that there would be a smaller amount of vocabulary. So I don't have to dwell on that. I think everybody knows when we look at Northeast Arnhem Land, we are looking at Maypilama, Elko, Bilingimbi, and we also gathered data on in Mirkala a while ago for a bigger project that the European Science Foundation funded. And it was one of the 3 projects I was looking after. So Yolŋu Sign Language and some others, always indigenous sign language, that was a focus, and their endangerment. Here in the East Kimberley, we have, as you can see here, Kununurra, and on Miriwoong Land, and the sign language found in with Miriwoong, what we call the Miriwoong Sign Language. I'm sorry, I can't get access to my notes, so that's why I'm also trying to put together things that I can remember. Okay, so where do we find bimodal bilingualism? So most studies in the field focus on well-documented language pairs, such as American Sign Language with American English, or German Sign Language with German, N. So if you look at this field of research, you see we have quite a lot of studies concentrating on those language pairs, and they are well documented, and they are different from what we find here. So the bimodal bilingualism we find here differs in several ways, but let's say one is that we find them in remote areas, and in these remote areas we have what we call small-scale multilingualism, for instance. And also, as compared to, okay, let me get that here, as compared to what happens in the States and in many Western countries, where the sign language is, let's say, is used or is also acquired or learned by hearing people only if they have some sort of ties, connection with the deaf community. Okay, so for instance, very often you will see that people have siblings who are deaf. So what would happen, or kids who are deaf, the codas, as we call them, children of deaf adults. So children are deaf or parents are deaf. So that's where you would find people using bimodal bilingualism because they have to communicate in both modalities. But that's a different story as compared to what we see in the remote areas. And the speakers here in these remote areas use several indigenous languages with a long oral tradition, and many of these languages are endangered. I put this here because it's important when we look at what's happening with these languages, how they influence each other, for instance, in the bimodal bilingual setting. And again, when we look at what's happening in many other Western cultures, we find that over there you have English, okay, and standard English, for instance, in the States, and then you have the ASL, all well established. But it's not a sort of a normal thing to have a speaker speaking several languages, and I mean, as we see here in this context. And this is going to influence or has some impact on the way they communicate. Okay, so the hearing people, and that's also important, the hearing people in these remote communities use sign language with the hearing community and with deaf members, of course, to communicate, but also within the hearing community, which is not something which you find elsewhere, okay? So in the case of the Yolŋu Sign Language, we've come to the realization, we started with the assumption that it is an alternate sign language, and then we came to the realization that you can look at it broadly as an alternate sign language, but it is both language modalities are used almost all the time. And so we would not, that's what I said before, we are still not happy with the term alternate, as Kendon argued, because Kendon did his work in central desert area, and that's why he found this sort of alternation taking place. Another point to add here is that when we look at the sign language, probably we'll have a question later, how do we distinguish between sign language and gestures? It's not always very easy. And now I think and that's my personal opinion, we have to be a bit more, we have to relax a bit all these restrictions that we have. It's good to have these very clear, neat, square definitions, as we do in linguistics and probably also in other fields. But sometimes we need to be a little bit more lenient because they don't always account for other cases outside the, let's say, global north. I'm not trying to discriminate anything. I'm just trying to say, I can say more about this later. So gestures and signs, they work in hand, and very often you'll see some gestures being done, and also it's complete utterance in sign language. So that's why in these cases, when we have gestures, we refer to them as co-speech gestures. There are also other factors that influence or make this type of bimodal bilingualism different. As you know, the dense network of connectedness through the kinship, the shared cultural knowledge, the small-scale multilingualism that I have mentioned before, and also circumspection, which all together play a role in shaping the type of bimodal bilingualism, which is, according to us, deeply rooted into the culture. Songs, we see that in songs, ceremonies, dance, etc., as compared to elsewhere. It might have started as a cultural practice in some specific context, for instance, when speech was prohibited and silence was mandatory, but it is used differently today. Just to put you in the picture, these are the other contexts of use that have been documented in the field. For instance, during mourning periods, as I've said, hunting, conversation among deaf people, long-distance communication in trucks, boats, asking for permission, for instance, to pass certain stretches of land or sea. Daily interaction when speech is too effortful or inappropriate, indiscreet, and secret communication. And as I've said, I missed that when conversing with deaf people. Yeah. So here is Lawopa, who is also principal investigator, in the big project when we were looking at the documentation of Yolŋu Sign Language. So Lawopa talking to a deaf person or signing with a deaf person in okay, let me see if I can get that. talking about somebody past and the spirit of that person. Okay, so you can see that there is no other option. She has to sign. Another one is this, what we call the sort of long distance that you probably noticed here also in Darwin, waving, and then people said gesturing, but if you look carefully at what they are signing. They are giving some utterances, telling people, go there, don't, etc., etc. Wait, sorry. Yeah. So the next question is, who counts as a bimodal bilingual? As I've said, hearing people, hearing speakers by birth, multilingual in spoken languages and bimodal. That's more specific to the communities, and taking also into account that the whole community is bimodal bilingual. It doesn't apply to just a small group of people, as we see in other Western countries, for instance. As I've said, we have in many Western countries, we find that, who are the hearing bimodal? So it's only, as I've said, if you have some sort of ties connection, that you would become a bimodal bilingual. Both in the Yolŋu communities and the Miriwoong one, we saw that a bimodal bilingualism is the norm, and every member grows up with spoken languages and at least a sign language, right? So in the Yolŋu communities, we found Yolŋu Mata plus the Yolŋu Sign Language. In the Miriwoong one, it is, what's interesting here is we find the Kununurra Creole and sometimes Miriwoong, because as you probably know, Miriwoong, the traditional language, is severely endangered. And some of the speakers are not, they do have some vocabulary, but yeah, so Kununurra Creole / Miriwoong and Miriwoong Sign Language. I think I brought the book to show you. And here, it's also interesting to see that similar to the unimodal bilinguals, the bimodal bilinguals display variability in their grammars. For instance, in the form of hand shape, orientation, location, movement, all parameters of sign language. And there is nothing wrong with this variability, because people used to think, scholars used to think, oh, it's there. Look at these bilinguals, they're just going on. Variability in the spoken as well as in the signing utterances, and they thought it was, for a long time, it was regarded as something, as a sort of a weakness. But today, I think it's become clear, variability is what makes bilingualism interesting, because there is also this individual factor that plays a role. Individual, what I mean here is, not every bilingual is the same. You have, as I said, people learning the language at different ages, for instance, or even at birth. So there are different types of bilingual. Sorry, I've got this thing here. I have to dismiss it. So it has been suggested in the literature to look at bimodal bilinguals as heritage language users, because they share a lot of characteristics with unimodal bilinguals, and they behave, or at least more or less, like what we call heritage language users. But this doesn't really apply here. And a second point is that one of the reasons for looking at these bimodal bilinguals as heritage language users is because of the impact of acquisition factors, and also the amount of exposure to each language and context and topics. And I did say that. Now, one of the biggest points, innovation that has been noticed in bilingual interaction is both in unimodal and in bimodal bilinguals is the language mixing. And again, here we have a lot of studies, or most research focusing on the unimodal bilingual. It's quite recent, the research on bimodal bilinguals, so there is a lot to come still. But we know that, for instance, aspects co-determining language choice in the unimodal bilinguals have been extensively studied since the 70s, 80s, etc., etc. And we see, for instance, that group identity plays a role in the choice of language, etc. Now, looking at bimodal code switching, so the swapping around between languages, saying one part of the language Hoi, ik ben hier in Darwin, and I will continue my presentation in English. So today, I took a whole block in German and I put it, I tied it up to the rest of the sentence in English for instance. That would be a typical code switching, code mixing example, but it can get more complicated. So when we look at the bimodal code switching, as I've done previously, in my sentence, I had one spoken language and then I switched to the other one. In the bimodal code switching, speakers use one modality alone, either the sign or the spoken, and then switch to the other modality alone. And also, what we find is similar to the unimodal bilinguals. Bimodal bilinguals do have what we call intrasentential and code switch and intersentential. I will try and show you here. So she's trying to say, what time are you going? So she's signing at the same time. That's what we find the code switching, but also what we call the code blending. No, sorry, that's only the sign one. Okay, she's just pointing the sun and saying, well, what time are you going? Okay. Here is another example. I mean, these videos are quite slow sometimes, so yeah, I'll try and see what happens here. It's a normal conversation. They are discussing among each other how they are going to present certain sentences, and yeah, here it is.
Bueno, all the time.
Sorry for the echoing. Yeah. So as you can see, okay, I'll play it again. It's talking, signing, or just talking and signing, or talking and signing only one element from these two examples.
Bueno, all the time.
It's a whole sentence.
Bueno, all the time.
Sorry for the echo, we couldn't get rid of this echoing thing here. Yeah, this is, for instance, interesting. This is Lawopa here, explaining something. I don't know why I can't see the whole picture, but anyway, explaining something in science that the kids don't understand, and then she switches into spoken, but I cut it, it's too long. Okay, so that's the signing that happens in, but there is a code switching part that it became too long, so that's why I had to cut it here. She switches to Java on the other side. There is another one here.
I'm going to shop. I'm going to get a cold drink.
And here, what's interesting is she started in Creole, but then she switched to English, Aboriginal English, and what we find here, she's saying, "I'm going to the shop." She's signing and at the same time talking, but then she doesn't sign every element. So, for instance, when she says go to the shop, it's interesting to see that she uses this "I go shop." So she uses this movement away from the speaker's body, which is a typical sign for go towards something else. She goes like that instead of saying to. So she's using the I go and then this shop at the end point, and then she does this to, which means open a cold drink, to buy a cold drink. So she leaves out certain things, sign them. And yes, so that's what we call the code switching and also call code blending. Okay, so I will move that one. One thing is what I mentioned before is how to look at, how to analyze these utterances, these sort of intertwining between the signs and spoken language. Now, typical of bilinguals, we find here in the data that there is a lot of cross-linguistic influence. So, for instance, a typical example comes from negation, the use of negation in many sign languages. We find them duplicated. I mean, there is reduplication, as you can see here, me, neg, money, smoke, neg, negation. And what you don't find in a spoken language, right? And yet we find this happening. So which means that the sign language that they are using, or the signing system they are using, is also influencing the use of the spoken language by seeing these negation markers being repeated, or in a W question, what we call WH question, which is what. So here you've got the language, what do I tell you? Then what? So in that particular utterance, you see the wana being signed both times with I, and then the rest is lakaran, and then the direction. Here you've got an example of lawopa with yaka baro, so which is negation, and crocodile, no crocodile. So here, let me see if I can get that working. It's very quiet because she was, using. Oh, sorry. So yaka, she does this, and she says yaka, but then crocodile, and it's still the sign crocodile. So it's the combination of sign, speech / sign plus sign. Further examples of code blending, which is typical, which is unique to hearing Yolŋu Sign Language signers and others, is that sometimes the content, when they are signing and they are speaking at the same time, so this is articulated simultaneously, they don't always represent a sort of direct alignment. So I'll be signing and at the same time I say the word, and that's what makes it well, interesting, beautiful, and what makes it also very natural, because sign English is, for instance, a sort of invented system where people use sign and they connect different with words. So the word is being said, and then there is a sign for it, and they go on, they use it for pedagogical purposes, but here it's just the information. So as a result, what we find is it's not always congruent. So the person might be faster in the sign, and the word is coming after. So there is no alignment one-to-one. So here I would like you to have a look at what the lady is doing. This is the mother of Michael, and she is talking and at the same time signing. And Michael will say something because Michael is deaf and he signs, although he tries to articulate there are some mouthings and mouth gestures happening. Let me see if I can get that. Yeah. Tell them the story. Yeah, okay, Michael is talking about his uncle who went up fishing there, and all of a sudden he realized the water is up there and he's panicking. So, before that, his mum is telling Michael, please tell these people here, who are all sitting on the ground, the story. So, here. So, again, you can see the signing and the word tell. Pointing is also another very interesting, let's say, area in sign languages, and especially in bimodal bilingualism. Here we have Lawopa sitting at the front and giving this Bruce here, this chap here, some directions, and using both language and, well, sorry, English and gestures, or also partly Yolŋu Sign Language. Yeah, we have to turn on this side, yeah.
It's here, but we have to go,
Yeah, okay. The thing is, Lawopa is showing there are some very specific signs, or at least pointing gestures in Yolŋu Sign Language. Full hand, 3 fingers, and 2 fingers. They are different for different purposes. But here you can see she pointed this way with the full hand, but then she went this way also. She used so additional information, which is sometimes a bit redundant. But for somebody who is trying to listen and look at the sign, who is not conversant in the sign language and listening, it does help. It's additional information to find the way. Okay. yes, she's been signing this way, turn to the, well, sort of turn to the right. Okay. I'm sorry, yeah. I'm looking at I do have a few minutes. So this is another part here, another video clip with the people in on Miriwoong country, Miriwoong speakers. They are talking about the uncle, or at least Julie, this lady here is talking, my uncle is sitting, she's referring to Julie.
Yes, my uncle is sitting here.
Yeah. So she doesn't.
My uncle is sitting here.
Interesting here is she doesn't use the term, the kingship term for uncle, she just say my, and then sitting here, okay? She doesn't use it because everybody knows, that's what I mean with the shared cultural knowledge. Everybody knows who is the uncle, except for us behind the cameras. We were sort of new, so she doesn't have to sign. And also we see the same sort of behavior when it's when you're referring to somebody who is, I think the poison family, we call it in Aboriginal English. So you don't necessarily say the name or whatever, but you're referring, or you use other manuals, non-manual signs to refer to that person. But since it's a small community, everybody knows the uncle, that she doesn't have to sign it.
Yes.
Okay, so conclusion. First of all, before I do the conclusion, briefly, I wanted to say this is preliminary work. Actually, it is, let's say, a follow-up of a big project that we have. Because while we were looking at all the videos and looking again and checking up for other things, after producing the dictionary and the grammar, I realized that there was a lot of material here on bimodal bilingualism that could be used, and that could be sort of worked on to be able to show how this works in those communities. And so as conclusion, we can say that the type of community bimodal bilingualism here is different from the one documented in the field. And the focus here is, or at least we stress that it is very much culturally motivated. But on the other hand, we see that the those bilinguals, the hearing signers, the bimodal bilinguals, also show some of the typical bilingual effects. So for instance, the fact that all languages are on at the same time and competing with each other. And as you've probably seen, when they are signing, they're code blending, they are signing or code switching, it's a very smooth thing. They didn't have to stop, think about one, and then keep going. And also bimodal bilinguals code switch, but also, as we've seen, they do code blending. And there are 4 types that we've already seen happening in this data that we've collected. It's just a little bit of data here. Now, for the future research, it would be interesting, and we would like to go into that direction, what type of input the children receive. And I have teamed up with Professor Dany. Actually, we talked about that several times. We've watched the videos when she came to Germany. We've watched some of the videos here, but we haven't been able to establish something yet. Funding, as usual, but we're trying to find a way to do this. Because it would be interesting to see what type of input the kids get. Because we know that everybody in that community, and that was confirmed by La Wopa and the whole team, the hearing people especially, they learn a sign language. They start with gestures and they learn the sign language. And other interesting points are, for instance, how do the hearing bimodal bilinguals produce mirror errors? And we haven't found anything so far. That's interesting, but I don't want to give a firm statement on that. It's interesting to see that when you learn a sign language as a hearing person, you learn a sign language later in life. Very often the signer would be standing in front of you, would be signing, and the typical mistake is, oh, what is left, right, and you just get all confused, okay? Depending also on the dominant hand, and that's why we call it the mirror errors. The third point is variability. How much of that do we find in the bimodal bilingual language production? And also, we would need more in-depth research on the types of code blending. So I'm sure there is a bit more there than what we find in the field, or that what has been documented in the field. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dany. That was absolutely fascinating. and wonderful engagement with communities as well. I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions, both online but also in the room. So let me start with the room. Is there any questions here? Yeah,
My research is based with community perceptions of your parents around success and education. And I've had a number of conversations around, am I just going to record the audio or is it important to have visual as well? And I think this is really confirmed that I'm going to need to have the video as well.
Yes, you're right, absolutely right. This is a very interesting question because in early stages of first language acquisition, for instance, in the field in general, people used to do recording only. And also the use of camera was not that widespread. It was not that easy to get the funding and so people concentrated. But then they realized that in many language cases, it is not possible to just to take the language out of the context. You need the gestures, you need the movement. And we also speak today of multimodality in the use of, like, that is involved in the use of language. It's the gesture, like me, I'm doing these gestures, but they don't have semantic content. They are just there, you could say, as ornament, because I come from a culture where we gesture quite a lot, gesticulate, I think you say, quite a lot. So I need these hands, okay? So others wouldn't. So that's why we need this context of what's going on around, not only between the speakers, the kids and everything, the event, but also what's happening with the hands, the eyes. And in these communities, we have a lot of non-manuals, as we call them, the mouthing, the mouth pointing, the foot pointing, that come into play. And if you don't have that context, it's difficult to analyze and get the information you need to do the linguistic analysis.
Shall I read this one out from Emily?
Yes.
Okay, so Emily Armstrong was
Yes,
asking a question. It's great to see these examples of the rich bimodal bilingual language environments in First Nations communities. I'm a speech pathologist and can think of a variety of applications of this work for culturally appropriate support for people with communication difficulties. What are your partner community goals for research work in bimodal bilingualism?
Yes, thank you very much, Emily. As I said, maybe I didn't say, but I wanted to say it at one point. It's work in progress. It's just started putting the things together. I would like, I'll have to talk to Lawopa too at one point. I've clarified with the Miriwoong because I went there first, and there is an interest. People would like to, we would like to put, to join forces and try and apply for some grant. I'm not sure about Australia, but I will certainly start with the European context because that's where I'm based, and we might be able to get something here. The community goals, well, first of all, is to make sure that, well, not make sure, is to show that this is a normal, it's the norm, this bimodal bilingual context. Also use it if people are interested to use some of the findings later for education and other purposes, as you've mentioned before. But this is something that we need to, we'll need to discuss. And actually, Emily, I think tomorrow we are talking with Lawopa on the phone, so I'll inform her and see how it goes. Because that's, as I said, it's just an outcome of the bigger project that we've done after producing the dictionary and the grammar.
Is there one behind that? Another question? No? Okay. Any more questions from the room? I've got one. No, oh, wait.
Yeah, you mentioned that one of the findings of studies of bilingualism is that it's rule-based. Are you finding something similar with the bimodal bilingualism? And what you say, can you sort of give an example?
Yeah, I mean, for instance, I mean, I don't have a lot of examples at this stage because I've been going through and picking some of the examples. For instance, let me think for the bimodal one, it's the combination of certain word classes, for instance, adjective, noun. So that would be, or verb, certain type of verbs with certain nouns as subject or object. That would be the type of examples. I'm thinking of a Yaka, a Barrow one, if that is, I think you can say in the Yolŋu matter, but I'm a bit rusty there, so I will need somebody to help me. Is it the order would be Yaka Baru, if you mean there is no crocodile, there are no crocodiles. That would be the thing. So you wouldn't be using baru yaka, I think. And also there is, with the negation, it's a bit complicated because there is a binary, which is this sort of a thing, nothing, which means nothing, and plus the baru one. I'm thinking for the Creole in Miriwoong, again here you would find that, when I say rule govern, there are rules either in the spoken language or in the sign language. Okay, now they don't always they're not always compatible. But that's why I brought the example with the duplication of the WH questions, which is a typical pattern you find in sign languages across the world. You see the sign for what, and then you sign or you talk, and then what again at the end. I think in many communities it's this. So that's the rule govern thing, because you would not see what, you sign something, and then what, and you know what I mean? So this is what I mean. There is no violation of the rules, implicit rules in the languages given, whether it's a sign or, but there are sometimes incompatibilities. And the interesting thing is those who are fluent, and this is the case here with the bimodal bilingual, you won't find any miscommunication or any failure in communication. That is the type of thing you will observe in, for instance, in the data gathered with hearing signers who learn a sign language later in life, and they make heaps of sort of errors, mistakes, where there is a bit of, there is no alignment. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Or at least partly.
We've got a message up here, Dany, from Teresa Adler, and just saying fantastic research. Well done in many ways, my sister, and sending this from Nation, JavaScript.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Teresa.
Yes, thank you very much, Teresa.
Any other questions? I've got one. Can I ask mine?
Yes, please.
So I think that demarcation, if you like, and I understand it's a very difficult one, between gesture and sign.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
So they're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Is it about that?
Well, maybe I'll go to Bev's question, then I might add something.
Okay. Well, what is the definition and difference between gesture and sign? As I've said before in the presentation, sometimes there are certain definitions are very much dependent on what we are doing in the field, and they are artifacts, I would say. Okay. Now, having said this, it doesn't mean that this is the case here. Now, when we look at the early studies on gestures by Kendon and McNeil and all that, we see that they define gestures as part of the definition of gesture is one thing, one gesture, for instance, which is not regular across the community. Okay, so which is one would use this, especially with hearing people, hearing signers. One would use it in this way, the other one would use it. So, for instance, that's why we talked of parameters. There are 4 parameters, 4 parts that have been established how to define a sign: location, movement, orientation. And the other one, which I've forgotten now. But anyway, these parameters are taken into account when we analyze whether it's a gesture or it's a sign. That's the first thing. And it's also a matter of convention, because these countries that I've mentioned before, they have their sign language established, and at the national level, they are recognized as official sign languages. People are taught at school, and there's a lot being done to promote these languages. And there are signers using prescriptive rules that have been written down, so to say, in books to orient it. The same process as we see with standardization of spoken language. Now, these sign languages here are different in the sense that there is no prescriptive rules. I mean, there is a dictionary, but it's a descriptive way of looking at things. We describe what happens in the thing. We're not saying this is the way it has to be done. That's the next step if the community wanted to have that. So that's all of that discussion is tied up with the definition of gesture. What is a gesture and what is a sign? I personally, as I've said, I think we need to be a bit more lenient in this sort of in the spectrum. When we look at the work, a lot of scholars have said there is gesture, and then there is sign, home signs, for instance, and then finally you've got the sign language, where you find standardization and all that. But I think if we look at a community and we see that certain gestures have become conventionalized in the sense that they are used by everybody. I do that gesture, everybody understands. If I do something a bit different, people might not. So that's the starting point where a gesture is becoming established and firmly grounded into the community to become a sign, or is maybe also a sign. What I'm saying also is perhaps a little bit rebellious. I think we should. I've seen that I've been working a long time with a lot of languages, also outside Australia, Creole languages where things don't go the way we linguists, or not me, but linguists would like it to go. When it comes to definitions of languages, for instance, Creole languages are a typical example where people fight about certain terms, and dialects, languages and dialects all work well when we look at European languages, dialects, Dutch, German dialects, sister languages and all that. But when we apply the same criteria to other areas, we find that we can't always make this distinction language and dialects, especially with Australia, Indigenous Australia, with the land ownership, for instance. And what does dialect mean? When you speak to Aboriginal people, they tell you, that's my language, that's it, full stop, there is no dialect or whatever. So these sort of things are, if you look at these definitions from a decolonized perspective, these are things where we need to work on to improve, to be able to embrace what we have, all these other things that are not easily included into the field. Does that help? I'm happy to continue the conversation on gesture and sign, but
I think it does. Yeah.
Just a thought, really, a reflection on the short film that you showed of the people in the car driving along.
Yeah.
And I recently had a conversation with an artist about their painting, landscape painting.
Yes.
And I asked them to describe the landscape. And the artist, he pointed in this very, very precise and elegant way.
Yes.
He drew
Yes.
the different parts of the landscape as he was talking about them to me. And he sometimes spoke and sometimes was pointing.
Yes.
And I realised that I was only party to half of the information that he was communicating.
Yeah.
And so that kind of linear, it almost like drawing a map,
Yes.
is what I saw at the beginning of
Yes.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Like almost like you've got to go around the roundabout before you can turn right.
Yes.
And then there was a very, very strong gesture, which was,
This.
we're going right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there was also this kind of narrative about the route and the context of where you might be coming from and going to. And I'm just really interested in, because I look at visual language,
Yes.
I'm looking at art.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in perhaps the relationship between visual representation or mark making or gesture and an understanding of communication. But I don't know if you've looked at anything like that to do with images, the relationship between images and sign or images and gesture.
What about images are you referring to? Sorry, in the painting?
Yeah, so like a painting.
Yeah, like this one. Well, we had a few people explaining to us certain things, and if you go back to rock art, for instance, you'll see a lot of information there with the hand, the different hand signs, shapes, and everything. And yes, with actually one of the ideas that we had is not ideas. I mean, we've done some research myself and other people too. That's why I said before, the sign languages that we find here are deeply anchored into the culture. And if you take dances, you take the ceremonies, you take also the painting, you can see the use of certain gestures, but also certain hand signs that are now also seen in the Yolŋu Sign Language, for instance, or the Miriwoong. So there is a lot more there. So that's all I can say for now. But I think there is the sign languages that we've looked at up to now. They seem to have their roots, or at least we can explain their origin in the cultural domain, the painting, and this is evidence for us that signs have been around for quite a long time. Gestures and signs have been quite a long, but I haven't looked beyond.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we thank Dany again for a wonderful talk? Thank you. And we can go on talking with morning tea. So you're not going to get away from this yet.
No, it's a
But people online, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank
I
you.
can't see you, you can see us. And please feel Dany's here till Friday. I
Friday,
think.
yes, yes.
So no doubt if you've got other questions, I'm sure.
I'm very happy to.
do it.
Yeah.
Can also thank you as the audience, both online and here, for coming along. And remember, we've got another People Policy in Place seminar coming up next month on higher education students' First Nations experience in CEU. Okay, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for having me.